Samuel, a middle-aged cowboy with tired eyes, lives alone on the outskirts of the prairie. His ranch is small, the barn almost empty. He leads a stern, measured life, mending fences, tending a pair of horses, and tinkering in the garden. In the evenings, he sits on the porch and gazes out at the endless expanse, where an invisible threat lurks. A nomadic Comanche tribe roams nearby, and relations between them and the white settlers are tense, bordering on open hostility. Samuel's neighbors have long since moved to safer grounds, leaving him the last white man in this part of the territory. His loneliness is not only a physical burden, but also a mental one. Samuel awoke to the sound of the wind. It was a constant presence on the prairie, a whispering, moaning force that slid through the cracks between the rough-hewn logs of his cabin and stirred the dust on the hard-packed earth floor. The light seeping through the single small window was the dull gray of a long-dead fire, promising not a dawn, but a slow, grim brightening into another day of isolation. For a long moment, he did not move, his body aching with a fatigue that had little to do with sleep. The cot beneath him was thin and lumpy, and the coarse wool blanket scratched against his skin. He listened, as he did every morning, to the sounds of his world. The wind, of course, was the loudest, but beneath it was the faint, anxious skittering of a mouse in the corner, the groan of the wooden sign above the porch as it swung on a single rusted chain, and the absolute silence from the world outside his own four walls. That was the heaviest sound of all. With a grunt that was part effort and part habit, he swung his legs over the side of the cot. The floorboards were icy against his bare feet. He dressed methodically, his movements precise and economical. First, the faded long johns, then the heavy wool trousers, worn smooth and soft in the seat and knees. His flannel shirt was patched at both elbows, the cuffs frayed. Over it, he pulled on a thick vest, its leather cracked with age. Each item was a layer against the emptiness, a small defense against the vastness that waited just beyond his door. He pulled on his socks, and then his boots, the leather stiff and cold, lacing them with fingers that were gnarled and calloused, the nails rimmed with a permanent line of grime that no amount of washing could erase. His morning ritual was as unchanging as the horizon. He stirred the embers in the small stone fireplace, adding a few pieces of precious kindling and one split log, nursing the weak flame back to life. The cabin was small, just one room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and parlor. A rough-hewn table stood under the window, a single chair pushed against it. On a shelf were a few tins of food, a sack of flour that was worryingly light, and a coffee canister that held little more than a dusting of grounds. His rifle, a Winchester Model 1873, leaned against the wall by the door, its wood stock darkened by years of sweat and use. It was less a weapon there than a piece of furniture, a familiar, silent companion. He poured water from a chipped ceramic pitcher into a tin pot and set it to boil on the fire. While he waited, he stepped outside onto the narrow porch. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of sagebrush and cold earth. His homestead was a small, defiant scratch on the face of the immense prairie. Before him stretched the grassland, a sea of fading gold and brown that rolled away to meet a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the earth whole. To the west, the land rose in gentle, hazy waves, and beyond them, he knew, were the territories where men like him were no longer welcome. His own land was marked by a crooked fence that needed mending in a dozen places. A small corral held his two horses, a sturdy bay gelding and an older, quieter mare. Their presence was a comfort, a sign of life. Beyond the corral stood his barn, its roof sagging in the middle like the back of a tired old mule. The doors hung slightly ajar, revealing a dark interior that held little more than some rusted tools and a dwindling stack of hay. He was the last one left. The other homesteaders, the hopeful families who had staked their claims alongside his years ago, had all been worn down and driven back. Some by drought, some by loneliness, some by the quiet, persistent hostility of the land and its original people. The nearest town was a 2-day ride away, a journey he made only when absolutely necessary, to trade furs for bullets, flour, and coffee. Those trips were exercises in endurance, a reminder of a world of noise and people that he had almost forgotten how to navigate. Out here, the silence was a physical thing. It pressed in on the ears, broken only by the wind and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high overhead. He drank his coffee, black and bitter, standing on the porch. It was the one luxury he allowed himself, and even that was becoming harder to sustain. His eyes, a pale blue, faded by years of squinting into the sun, scanned the horizon with a practiced, weary vigilance. He was not a young man. The lines on his face were deep-etched maps of hardship and solitude. His hair, what was left of it under his worn hat, was the color of granite. He had come west with dreams, like all the others. Dreams of land, of cattle, of a future. Those dreams had dried up and blown away like tumbleweed, leaving behind the stark reality of survival. After his coffee, his work began. There was always work. He spent the morning mending a section of the fence where the posts had rotted at the base. The work was hard and monotonous. He dug out the old posts, the blisters on his hands breaking open and healing again in the same motion. He hauled new posts from a pile of timber he had cut last fall, his back protesting with each lift. The sun climbed, a pale disk behind a high veil of cloud, offering little warmth. The horses watched him from the corral, their tails switching lazily. He worked with a slow, deliberate pace, conserving his energy. There was no one to impress, no one to help him. The rhythm of the labor was its own purpose, a way to mark the passage of time, to keep the thoughts at bay. He thought about the boy sometimes. The memory was a ghost that haunted the edges of his consciousness, especially during these long, silent hours of work. A boy with his own laugh, his own future, all gone now, taken by a fever that the isolation and lack of a proper doctor made inevitable. That loss had been the final blow, the thing that had hollowed out his wife and then himself, sending her back east to her family and leaving him here, a custodian of a grave and a failed dream. The small wooden cross at the far edge of the property was the only thing he tended with more care than his fence. He ate a sparse lunch of cold cornbread and a strip of jerky, sitting on a stump near the barn. His gaze was drawn again to the western horizon. He knew the Comanche were out there. He had seen the signs, a distant dust cloud, the silhouette of a rider on a ridge at sunset, the occasional track where there should be none. There was an unspoken understanding, a tense, fragile peace born of distance and mutual disregard. They left him alone, and he did not trespass into their lands. It was a border as real as any river, and he was careful not to cross it. He was not a brave man, not in the heroic sense. He was a practical man. He knew that 200 years of his people's history on this continent would mean nothing against a single Comanche arrow if that peace shattered. The afternoon was spent in the barn, sharpening tools, trying to fix a harness that was nearly worn through. The light inside was dim, thick with dust motes dancing in the slivers of sun that cut through the cracks in the walls. The air smelled of dry hay, old wood, and the sharp, honest scent of horse sweat. It was a smell he found comforting. As he worked, his mind drifted not to the past, but to the immediate future. Winter was coming. He could feel it in the bite of the wind, see it in the way the birds gathered in large, noisy flocks. He needed to hunt, to lay in a store of meat. He needed to check his traps along the creek bed. The list of tasks was long, and his own strength felt shorter with each passing season. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of violet and bruised orange, a profound loneliness settled over him, heavier than the wool blanket on his cot. It was a feeling so familiar it was almost a part of him, like his own shadow. It was the loneliness of a man who had outlived his time, who was clinging to a piece of earth that no one else wanted. He fed the horses, his hands moving over their warm, solid flanks, taking a small measure of comfort from their simple animal presence. They were dependents, a reason to get up in the morning. Without them, the silence would be absolute. He was about to head back to the cabin for the night when he saw it. A movement, slight and furtive, near the far corner of the barn. His hand went instinctively to the knife at his belt. He stood perfectly still, his breath catching in his throat. It was too small for a wolf, too large for a prairie dog. He squinted, his heart hammering against his ribs. The figure emerged from the shadows, and Samuel felt a cold dread wash over him. It was a child, a boy no more than 10 years old, dressed in little more than rags. His skin was the color of weathered copper, and his black hair was matted with dust. But it was the boy's eyes that held Samuel frozen. They were huge, dark pools of pure desperation, wide with a hunger that was more than physical. It was the hunger of a lost soul. The boy stood shivering, his thin arms wrapped around himself. He made no sound, but his whole body was a plea. He was Comanche. There was no doubt. And he was here, on Samuel's land, a violation of that fragile peace. Every instinct, every story Samuel had ever heard, screamed at him to be cautious, to be afraid. This could be a trick, a trap. Where there was one child, there could be warriors waiting in the tall grass. His eyes darted to the Winchester leaning by the cabin door, too far away to be of any use. He looked back at the boy. The fear in the child's eyes was not a weapon. It was a reflection of his own. It was the raw, unvarnished terror of someone who had reached the very end of their strength. Samuel's own fear began to recede, replaced by a colder, heavier emotion, a recognition of shared desolation. This boy, alone and starving, was as lost in this vastness as he was. The politics of the territory, the unspoken rules, the generations of conflict, all of it shriveled into insignificance before the simple, undeniable fact of a hungry child. His hand relaxed its grip on the knife. He took a slow, deliberate step back, then another, never taking his eyes off the boy. He moved toward the cabin door, his movements slow and non-threatening. The boy watched him, trembling, poised to flee. Inside, Samuel's mind raced. He had so little. The flour sack was nearly empty. The jerky was his own sustenance for the days ahead. But he could not turn the child away. It was an impossibility, a line his soul would not let him cross. He took a bowl from the shelf and ladled in a portion of the thin stew that simmered over the fire. It was mostly broth with a few chunks of potato and rabbit, but it was hot and nourishing. He found a piece of hardtack and placed it on top. Then, holding the bowl carefully, he walked back outside. The boy had not moved. Samuel stopped a good 10 paces away. He did not speak. Words would be meaningless. Instead, he slowly bent down and placed the bowl on the ground. He then straightened up, took several steps back, and stood with his hands open at his sides, a universal gesture of harmlessness. For a long moment, the boy remained frozen. Then, driven by a need greater than his fear, he darted forward, snatched the bowl, and retreated back into the shadows of the barn. He did not even use the hardtack. He simply drank the broth in frantic, greedy gulps, his small body shuddering with the effort. Samuel stood and watched. He felt a strange, hollow ache in his chest. It was not pity, but something deeper, a connection forged in the shared silence of their suffering. When the boy was finished, he looked up at Samuel. The desperation in his eyes had softened, replaced by a flicker of something else, confusion, perhaps, or a dawning curiosity. He placed the empty bowl carefully on the ground, his eyes still locked on the old cowboy. Then, without a sound, he turned and melted back into the gathering twilight, disappearing as quickly as he had come. Samuel waited until he was sure the boy was gone. He walked over and picked up the empty bowl. The evening was now cold and dark. The wind seemed to have grown sharper. He looked out toward the western hills, where the last light was fading. He had no idea what his small act of kindness would mean. He had broken the one rule he had lived by for years. He had engaged. He went back into his cabin, bolted the door, and sat by the fire, listening to the wind with a new, profound sense of unease. The silence outside was no longer empty. It was waiting. The night was long and filled with a tension that was unfamiliar to the cabin. Samuel lay on his cot, his eyes open, staring into the absolute blackness of the room. The wind, his constant companion, now seemed to carry whispers. Every creak of the old timber, every rustle of dry grass against the wall, was amplified by his racing mind. The image of the boy's face, gaunt and terrified, was burned onto the back of his eyelids. He had acted on an impulse, a raw human instinct that had overridden a lifetime of learned caution. Now, in the cold silence, the calculations returned. A lone Comanche child did not simply appear. Where was his family? His tribe? The act of feeding him, while feeling like a moral necessity, could be interpreted in a dozen different, dangerous ways. It could be seen as an insult, an admission of guilt, or a sign of weakness. He had placed a bet with fate, and the stakes were his life. He must have slept, for he was jolted awake by the sudden, stark silence. The wind had died. It was a phenomenon on the prairie, this abrupt cessation, and it was often more unnerving than the fiercest gale. The pre-dawn light filtering through the window was a pale, milky gray, leaching the color from the world. The air was still and cold, heavy with a dew that felt like frost. He dressed quickly, his movements sharp with a nervous energy he hadn't felt in years. His body felt old and stiff, but his senses were painfully alert. He bypassed his usual coffee, his stomach a tight knot of apprehension. He needed to see. He needed to know what the new day had brought. He unbolted the heavy wooden door, the sound of the latch echoing in the unnatural quiet. He pulled it open just enough to peer out, his hand resting on the cool, worn wood of the doorframe. The world outside was monochrome, bathed in the flat, shadowless light of a clouded dawn. His breath plumed in the frigid air. His gaze swept the familiar landscape, the crooked fence, the quiet horses in the corral, the sagging barn. Everything was as he had left it. For a fleeting moment, a wave of foolish relief washed over him. Perhaps it had meant nothing. Perhaps the boy was just a lost soul, and the incident was over. Then he turned his head to the west, towards the low, rolling hills that marked the edge of his claim and the beginning of the vast, contested territories. His breath caught in his throat, and for a second, his heart seemed to stop entirely. They were there. Not a scattered group, not a hunting party. A line. A solid, unbroken, impossibly long line of warriors on horseback, stretched across the horizon as far as the eye could see in both directions. They were silent and motionless, a frieze carved from the very landscape. The sheer number was staggering, a force of nature made manifest. 200? Perhaps more. It was impossible to count them individually. They were a single entity, a dark living wall. The distance was too great to make out individual features, but the collective impression was one of immense, patient power. Their ponies were still, their heads drooping. The warriors sat straight, their forms dark against the gray sky. There were no war cries, no threatening gestures. Their silence was more terrifying than any noise could have been. Samuel's body went cold, then hot. A primal fear, the kind that bypasses thought and screams directly to the spine, locked his muscles. His first, overwhelming instinct was to slam the door, barricade himself inside, and grab his rifle. It was the instinct of every settler's story he had ever heard, the final, desperate act of a man cornered. His hand twitched towards the Winchester leaning by the door. His fingers brushed the cold metal of the barrel. But he stopped. He forced his breathing to slow, forcing air into his frozen lungs. Panic would kill him as surely as an arrow. He made himself look again to really see. They were not advancing. They were not forming for a charge. They were simply present. They had arrived with the dawn, and now they waited. It was a display, a statement. But what was it saying? His eyes, straining against the distance, scanned the line. And then he found him, near the center of the formation, mounted on a paint horse that was slightly larger than the others, was a figure who commanded attention even from afar. His posture was erect, his head held high. This was their leader, and seated in front of him, on the withers of the great horse, was a small figure. The boy, the child from the previous evening. He was sitting upright, held securely by the warrior. He was not a prisoner. He was being presented. The sight of the boy changed the equation entirely. This was not a random war party. This was a deliberate response to his action. The food he had given had been a stone dropped into a still pond, and these warriors were the resulting wave. His mind raced, discarding the scenarios of mindless violence. This was a negotiation, but one conducted in a language he did not fully understand. The terms were his life, his land, his very existence. He knew the stories of Comanche justice, of their intricate codes of honor and revenge. An offense demanded payment, a life for a life. But what was the offense? Feeding a hungry child? Or was the offense the child's presence on his land to begin with? The ambiguity was a torture in itself. He made his decision then. It was not a decision of courage, but one of grim practicality. If they had wanted to kill him, they could have done so in the night, silently. They could have overrun the cabin in seconds. They had not. They were waiting for something. For him. To run was to die. To fight was to die. His only option was to meet this on their terms, whatever they might be. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed the door fully open. He stepped out onto the porch, his boots sounding unnaturally loud on the wooden planks. The cold morning air bit into his skin. He felt exposed, a single, fragile figure against an army. He walked to the edge of the porch, his movements careful and deliberate, devoid of any aggression. He stopped at the top of the 2 steps that led down to the hard-packed earth of his yard. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. It was a physical pressure, like a hand pressing against his chest. He did not raise a hand in greeting. He did not speak. He simply stood there, his own silent statement. He was not hiding. He was not threatening. He was present, just as they were. He kept his hands visible, held slightly away from his body, his palms open. He forced himself to look at the leader, to meet that distant, unreadable gaze. It was one of the hardest things he had ever done. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to look away, to submit, to flee. But he held his ground. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft snort of one of his own horses in the corral, nervous at the strange, silent presence. The line of warriors remained perfectly still. It was a test of wills, a battle fought without a single shot being fired. Samuel's legs began to tremble from the strain and the cold. He locked his knees, refusing to show any weakness. Then movement. The central figure, the leader, nudged his horse forward. He did not gallop or charge. He walked the animal at a slow, dignified pace, separating from the immense line. He was coming alone. The boy remained seated in front of him. As the distance closed, Samuel could make out more details. The warrior was a man in his prime, his face a mask of stern authority, lined with experience and weather. He wore a breechclout and leggings, and a single eagle feather was tied in his long, dark hair. His chest was bare despite the cold, a testament to his hardiness. He rode with an effortless grace that made the powerful horse seem like an extension of his own body. He rode until he was about 50 paces from the porch, well within rifle range, an act of either supreme courage or a clear message that he did not consider Samuel a threat. He stopped there. His eyes, dark and penetrating, swept over Samuel, the cabin, the corral, taking in every detail of this lone white man's existence. His expression was not one of anger, but of intense, focused assessment. He looked like a man weighing a matter of great importance. His gaze then fell to the boy in front of him. He placed a hand on the child's shoulder, a gesture that was neither gentle nor harsh, but possessive. Then he looked back at Samuel and raised his empty hand, pointing first at the boy, then directly at Samuel. The meaning was clear. Explain. Samuel's mouth was dry as dust. Words were useless. He had to speak in a language they both understood. He raised his own hands, moving them slowly. He pointed to the boy, then to his own eyes, mimicking the act of seeing him last night. He then pantomimed the boy's shivering, hugging his own arms and shaking. He pointed to the cabin, then mimed the act of ladling stew into a bowl. He walked slowly down the porch steps, knelt on the ground, and mimed placing a bowl down, then retreating. He pointed to the boy again, then to his own mouth, mimicking eating. He finished by spreading his empty hands wide, a gesture of offering, and then of emptiness. I had little. I shared it. That is all. The warrior watched, his face an unreadable stone mask. He gave no indication of understanding or belief. When Samuel was finished, the warrior's eyes narrowed. He turned his head slightly, looking back at his assembled people, a sea of silent judgment. Then he turned back to Samuel. In one fluid, powerful motion, he drew a long, stone-tipped spear from a sheath on his horse's flank. Samuel's heart leaped into his throat, his body bracing for the throw. But the warrior did not throw it. Instead, he leaned down and with a sharp, decisive motion, drove the butt of the spear into the earth. It stood there upright, a stark, vertical line between them. It was not a weapon aimed at his heart. It was a challenge, a demand for proof. It was a symbol of his power, planted firmly in Samuel's world, and it demanded a response. The silent question hung in the cold morning air, more terrifying than any shouted threat. "What now, old man?" The spear stood as a stark, silent accusation in the hard-packed earth. Samuel's eyes remained locked on the warrior chief, but his mind was racing, a frantic animal scrambling for purchase on a sheer cliff. The planted spear was not an immediate death sentence. It was a question, a test of honor posed in a language of symbols and actions. Words had been useless. Gestures had been insufficient. Now he had to answer with something tangible, something that spoke louder than fear or suspicion. He had to answer with sacrifice. His gaze slowly drifted from the chief's impassive face to the small boy perched on the horse. The child's dark eyes were wide, watching him with a mixture of fear and a flicker of the same curiosity he had shown the night before. That look was a tiny, fragile thread of connection. Samuel knew then that his only currency was his own scarcity. He had to show them that his act of giving had cost him something. He had to prove that the broth and hardtack were not trivialities, but a genuine sharing of his own meager survival. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture not of agreement, but of understanding. He was acknowledging the challenge. He broke eye contact with the chief, a dangerous move that felt like turning his back on a predator, but it was necessary. He turned and walked back towards his cabin. Every step was an agony of exposed vulnerability. He could feel the gaze of the entire war party on his back, 1,000 invisible points of pressure. The air itself seemed thick and heavy, resisting his movement. He expected at any moment to feel the sharp, final impact of an arrow or a bullet between his shoulder blades. His spine tingled with the anticipation of it. He pushed the cabin door open and stepped into the dim, familiar space. The contrast was jarring. Here was the entirety of his world, his hard-won sanctuary, smelling of wood smoke and old leather. And outside, an army that could erase it all in minutes. His eyes swept over his pitiful possessions. The nearly empty flour sack, the few strips of jerky hanging from a rafter, the coffee canister with its precious few grounds. This was his life, measured in handfuls. To give any of it away was to gamble with days of future hunger. But the gamble outside was for his immediate life. He moved to the flour sack, untied the rough cord, and stared at the pale contents. This was his bread, his thickening for stew, his last resort. He lifted the sack, feeling its devastating lightness. He carried it outside, the coarse fabric rough against his hands. He did not look at the warriors as he walked back to the spot before the chief. He placed the sack of flour on the ground, next to the standing spear. It looked pathetically small, an insignificant offering before such power. He returned to the cabin. Next, he took the jerky, all of it. The dried, tough strips represented protein, strength, the energy needed for hard labor. He laid them in a small pile beside the flour. Then he went back for the coffee. This was the hardest. It was his one small comfort, a ritual that made the loneliness bearable. The canister felt heavy with symbolic weight. He placed it carefully next to the other items. He was stripping his larder bare, offering up his future for the chance of a present. The small heap of provisions looked laughable against the backdrop of 200 warriors. But he was not finished. Words and food were not enough. He had to speak with his body, with his spirit. He had to show submission, not as a slave, but as a man acknowledging a power greater than his own. He walked back to a spot a few feet in front of the chief's horse. He moved slowly, his movements heavy with the weight of the moment. Then he did the most difficult thing he had ever done. He lowered himself to the ground. He sat in the dust of his own yard, cross-legged, and placed his hands on his knees, palms up. He dropped his gaze from the chief's face to the ground in front of him. It was a posture of ultimate vulnerability. He was unarmed, seated, looking down. In the language of the plains, it was a sign of trust and respect. It said, "I place myself in your hands. I will not fight." The silence that followed was more profound than any that had come before. The only sound was the soft whisper of the wind across the prairie and the restless shifting of the horses in the war party. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. He had played his final card. There was nothing left. He had given his food, and he had given his pride. All that remained was to wait for the judgment. He did not have to wait long. He heard the soft thud of moccasins hitting the ground. He risked a glance upward. The chief had dismounted. He lifted the boy down from the horse and set him gently on his feet. Then the warrior walked forward, past the spear, past the small pile of provisions. He stopped directly in front of Samuel, looking down at him. His shadow fell over Samuel, blocking out the weak morning sun. Samuel kept his head bowed, his hands open. The chief stood there for a long moment, a towering figure of muscle and authority. Then he did not speak, but he made a soft, guttural sound, a command. Two warriors detached themselves from the line and rode forward at a walk. They dismounted with the same fluid grace as their leader. Samuel braced himself, expecting to be seized, dragged away, or killed on the spot. But the warriors walked past him. They went to the pile of provisions. One picked up the sack of flour, the other the jerky and coffee. They did not examine them with greed or contempt. They handled them with a kind of solemn practicality. They carried the items not back to the war party, but past Samuel, towards his own cabin. They placed them carefully, almost reverently, on the porch. Then they returned to their horses and remounted. Samuel watched, utterly confused. His offering had been refused. No, not refused. It had been returned. The chief, still standing over Samuel, then gestured to one of the warriors who had remained mounted. The man urged his horse forward. Tied across the back of his pony was the carcass of a young deer freshly killed, its coat still glossy. The warrior rode up to the cabin and, with a heave, slid the deer from his horse, letting it fall with a soft thud onto the ground next to the porch. It was a large animal, enough meat to feed a man for weeks. The message was stunning in its clarity. It was not a transaction. It was a reciprocity. The chief was not here to take. He was here to see what kind of man Samuel was. The meager offering of flour and jerky, given from a place of genuine poverty, had been understood. The posture of submission had been accepted. The deer was not payment, it was an answer. It was a gift of greater value, a statement of honor, and a declaration that the balance between them had been restored, not broken. The chief looked down at Samuel one last time. His stern expression had not softened, but something in his eyes had changed. The intensity of judgment had been replaced by a glint of what might have been respect. He turned without another gesture, walked back to his horse, and swung up into the saddle with effortless power. He gathered the reins, and the boy, who had been watching the entire scene with wide, silent eyes, was lifted back up in front of him. Then the chief raised his hand, not in threat, but in a signal. A single, sharp cry echoed from the line, a sound that was neither a war whoop nor a shout, but a command. As one, the immense formation of warriors began to move. They did not charge. They simply turned their horses, a seamless, flowing motion of muscle and purpose, and began to ride back the way they had come. They moved at a walk, then a trot, their figures growing smaller, merging back into the landscape from which they had emerged. Within minutes, the horizon was empty again, save for the lingering dust cloud that slowly dissipated on the wind. Samuel remained seated on the ground, unable to move. The silence rushed back in, but it was a different silence now. It was not empty. It was filled with the echo of what had just happened. He looked at the deer carcass by his porch, then back at the empty prairie. The spear was gone, retrieved by one of the warriors. The only evidence of the army's presence was the pattern of hoof prints pressed into the earth. He had not just survived, he had communicated. He had been measured and found acceptable. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for years was still there, but it was no longer a prison. It was simply space, and for the first time, he understood that he was not entirely alone in it. For a long time after the dust had settled and the last silhouette had vanished into the vastness of the prairie, Samuel remained seated on the ground. The cold earth seeped through his trousers, but he was numb to it. His mind, usually a quiet and orderly place, was a roaring chaos of relief, confusion, and a profound, trembling awe. The emptiness before him was no longer just empty. It was now inhabited by the ghost of 200 warriors, by the piercing gaze of their chief, and by the staggering weight of a gift that was also a verdict. The deer carcass lay by his porch, a dark, heavy shape against the bleached wood. It was too much meat for one man. It was a statement meant for a community, for a family. Its presence on his lonely plot of land was a silent mockery of his isolation and a breathtaking acknowledgement of his humanity. Slowly, feeling every one of his years in the creaking of his joints, he pushed himself to his feet. His legs were unsteady, as if he had been ill for a long time. He walked to the porch, his steps slow and deliberate. He did not touch the deer immediately. Instead, he picked up the sack of flour, the jerky, the coffee canister that had been returned to him. Their familiar weight in his hands felt different now. They were no longer just sustenance. They were artifacts of a transaction he still did not fully understand. He carried them inside the cabin and placed them back on their shelf. The simple act felt ritualistic, like returning sacred objects to an altar. Then he turned his attention to the deer. It was a young buck, lean and healthy. The kill had been clean, an arrow through the heart. There was no waste, no unnecessary suffering. It was the work of a skilled hunter who respected his prey. Samuel knelt beside it, his knife appearing in his hand as if by instinct. The work of butchering was hard, physical labor, and he welcomed it. It gave his shaking hands a purpose, something concrete to focus on that was not the terrifying memory of that silent, waiting army. The blood was warm on his hands, a stark, primal contrast to the cold morning air. He worked with the efficiency of a man who had done this 100 times, skinning the animal, separating the muscle from the bone, cutting the meat into manageable strips. Some would be smoked, some dried into jerky. The gift would not be wasted. As he worked, his mind began to settle, the initial shock giving way to a slow, dawning comprehension. The chief had not come for war. He had come for accountability. The boy was not just a boy. He was a member of the tribe, his life valuable. His disappearance, or his contact with a white man, had demanded an explanation. The display of force was not a prelude to massacre. It was a demonstration of the seriousness of the situation, a showing of the collective strength that stood behind that one small life. Samuel's offering of his own food, pathetic as it was, had been the correct response. It had shown that he understood the value of what he had interacted with. His subsequent act of sitting on the ground had been even more critical. It had shown respect. It had lowered his own status and acknowledged theirs. By returning his provisions and giving him a gift of greater value, the chief had done something extraordinary. He had not simply forgiven and trespassed. He had established a relationship. It was a relationship of unequals, to be sure, but it was a relationship nonetheless. It was based on a mutual, unspoken code of honor. Samuel had proven he had some understanding of that code. The deer was not charity. It was a reciprocal gesture, sealing a pact that had been made without a single word being spoken. He was now, in some strange, formal way, in their debt. But it was a debt of honor, not of subjugation. The rest of the day passed in a strange, dreamlike state. The ordinary chores of his life, feeding the horses, drawing water from the well, mending a harness, felt both the same and entirely different. The horizon, which he scanned out of habit, now held a new meaning. It was no longer just a boundary between his world and a world of danger. It was now a place where a different kind of order existed, an order that had just intersected with his own. The loneliness was still a physical presence, but the memory of those hundreds of eyes upon him made it feel less absolute. He had been seen, he had been judged, and he had been allowed to live. As evening drew in, he built a small fire in a pit near the cabin, preparing a frame to smoke the venison. The rich, earthy smell of the meat filled the air, a smell of survival, of unexpected bounty. He sat on his porch, sharpening his skinning knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape, 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 a soothing sound in the quiet. He looked out at the deepening twilight, at the first stars pricking through the violet sky. The fear had subsided, replaced by a deep, ruminative quiet. He thought of the boy's face, first in the shadows of the barn, then on the horse in front of the chief. There had been no fear in his eyes that second time, only a quiet observation. Samuel realized that his simple act of kindness had set in motion a chain of events far beyond his comprehension. It had drawn the attention of an entire nation. He had been tested, and in passing the test, he had altered his position in the delicate ecosystem of the territory forever. He was no longer just a forgotten relic on a failed homestead. He was a man who had shared his food with a Comanche child and had been answered not with violence, but with a gift of meat. The story, if it were ever told, would not be believed. A new caution settled over him, but it was a different kind than before. It was not the fear of a hidden arrow. It was the weight of a responsibility. The peace he now enjoyed was fragile, earned through a display of respect. Any action he took from this day forward would be measured against that moment. To be careless, to be greedy, to be disrespectful of the land or the animals, would be to violate the unspoken treaty. The chief's gaze felt like it was still upon him, a permanent witness. He finished sharpening the knife, held up the blade to catch the last light of the day. It was sharp enough to shave with. It was a tool for life, not death. He looked from the blade to the strips of venison hanging over the smoke, and for the first time in many years, Samuel felt a sense of something that was not quite peace, but was perhaps its close cousin, a precarious, hard-won balance. The world was still vast and dangerous, but he had found a place within its rules. It was enough. The days that followed were marked by a new and unfamiliar rhythm. The encounter at the dawn had etched itself into the very landscape, changing the quality of the light, the meaning of the silence. Samuel moved through his chores with a heightened awareness, every sense tuned to a different frequency. The butchering and smoking of the venison became a primary task, and the scent of wood smoke and curing meat was a constant, tangible reminder of the shift in his reality. It was a smell of providence, but also of obligation. The gift of the deer was not a one-time event to be consumed and forgotten. It was a thread that now connected his solitary existence to something vast and unknown. A week after the warriors departed, Samuel was mending a stretch of fence on the western edge of his property, the side that faced the endless rolls of hills. The work was slow, his mind only half on the task of hammering nails into warped wood. His eyes kept lifting, scanning the horizon not with fear, but with a watchful curiosity. It was then that he saw a single rider. The figure was distant, a small, dark speck moving against the golden grass, but it was coming from the west, and it was moving with a purpose that suggested a destination rather than aimless wandering. A tightness returned to Samuel's chest, a vestige of the old fear, but it was quickly tempered by a strange sense of anticipation. He did not reach for the rifle leaning against a fence post. Instead, he laid down his hammer and stood straight, wiping the sweat from his brow with a bandana. He waited. As the rider drew closer, details emerged. It was not the chief. This warrior was younger, his horse a little less imposing. He carried a bow and a quiver of arrows, but they were slung across his back, not held at the ready. He rode up to the boundary of Samuel's land, the invisible line that had been so dramatically reinforced, and stopped. He made no gesture, no sound. He simply sat on his horse and looked at Samuel. After a long moment, the warrior dismounted. He led his horse by the reins as he stepped over the crooked fence, a deliberate act of crossing into Samuel's world. Samuel remained still, his hands held loosely at his sides. The warrior stopped a dozen paces away. His eyes were dark and intent, but held none of the formidable judgment of the chief's gaze. This was an appraisal of a different kind. Then, the warrior did something unexpected. He pointed to a section of the fence that Samuel had not yet gotten to, a portion where the posts were rotten, and the wires sagged nearly to the ground. He then pointed to himself and back to the fence. The meaning was clear and utterly astonishing. He was offering help. Samuel, after a moment of stunned silence, gave a slow nod. He picked up his hammer and walked over to the broken section. The warrior tethered his horse to a surviving post and joined him. He worked with a quiet, focused efficiency. His strength was impressive. Where Samuel struggled to pull a nail from hardened wood, the warrior did it with a single, fluid pull of a tool he produced from his own belt. They did not speak. There were no smiles, no gestures of camaraderie. It was a silent, shared labor. The warrior understood the principles of the task intuitively, and within an hour, they had replaced 2 rotten posts and tightened the sagging wires. The fence stood straighter, stronger than it had in years. When the work was done, the warrior wiped his hands on his leggings. He looked at Samuel, gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, and then walked back to his horse. He mounted up and rode back the way he had come, without a backward glance. Samuel stood by the mended fence, watching him disappear. The encounter had lasted little more than an hour, but its impact was profound. It was not an act of friendship. It was something more formal, more significant. It was an act of reciprocity, another thread in the weaving of this unspoken agreement. The gift of meat had been answered with the gift of labor. Several days later, it happened again. This time, it was 2 warriors. They arrived in the same manner, silent and purposeful. One carried a haunch of fresh antelope. The other pointed to the sagging roof of the barn, then to a pile of timber Samuel had cut but lacked the strength to lift into place for repairs. Again, the silent work commenced. The warriors hoisted the heavy beams with an ease that Samuel could only watch with a mixture of envy and gratitude. They worked on the barn roof for the better part of the afternoon, their movements synchronized and expert. Samuel worked alongside them, fetching tools, holding beams steady. The silence was not awkward, it was purposeful, a shared focus on a common task. When they left, the barn roof was measurably sturdier, and a new haunch of meat hung from the porch rafters. These visits became a pattern, though never a predictable one. Sometimes a week would pass, sometimes only a few days. Sometimes it was 1 warrior, sometimes 2. They never came into his cabin. They never touched his belongings beyond the work they came to do. They repaired his corral. They helped him dig a new post hole for a well cover. Each time, they brought something: a bundle of expertly tanned hides, a pouch of medicinal smelling herbs, a freshly caught fish from a river Samuel knew was a 2-day ride away. And each time, they left his homestead a little more sound, a little more viable than it had been before. Samuel began to understand. This was not charity. This was a weaving. He was being incorporated in a small, precise way into the fabric of their world. His survival was becoming a matter of their interest. The lone white man on the edge of the territory was no longer an anomaly to be tolerated or eliminated. He was a thread that had been tested and found strong enough to be woven into the edge of the pattern. The chief's initial judgment had been the first stitch, and these visits were the subsequent, careful weaving. He was being granted a status, a role. He was the man who had shared his food. In return, they shared their strength, their skills, their bounty. The balance was being maintained, not through words or treaties, but through action and mutual, silent respect. The immense loneliness that had been Samuel's constant companion began, for the first time, to genuinely recede, not because he had company, but because he had a place. It was a place defined by silence and hard work, but it was a place nonetheless, and it was more than he had ever hoped to have again. The first snow came not as a gentle flurry, but as a hard, driving wall of white carried on a wind that screamed down from the north. It blotted out the sun and turned the world into a roaring, featureless void. Samuel had spent the day preparing, battening down the hatches, securing the animals in the barn with extra feed. stacking firewood high inside the cabin. He knew the signs. This was not a storm, it was a blizzard, the kind that could bury a man and his homestead without a trace. For 3 days, the world ceased to exist beyond the 4 walls of his cabin. The wind was a constant maddening shriek, and the snow piled up against the door and window, sealing him in a tomb of ice and howling silence. He huddled by the fire, burning through his woodpile at an alarming rate, the cold a living thing that clawed at the cracks in the logs. The world had shrunk to the size of a single room. The carefully established rhythms of the fall, the silent visits, the sense of connection, felt like a dream from another lifetime. Here, in the heart of the storm, he was utterly alone again, a speck fighting against the indifference of nature. On the 4th day, the wind finally died. The sudden silence was as shocking as the storm's fury had been. It was a thick, heavy quiet, broken only by the occasional groan of snow-laden branches. Samuel pushed against the cabin door, having to shove hard against the deep drift that had sealed him in. He finally forced it open enough to squeeze out onto the porch. The world was transformed. A blanket of unbroken white stretched to the horizon, deep and pristine, glittering under a weak, pale sun. The familiar landmarks, his fence, the corral, the shape of the land itself, were smoothed into gentle, alien curves. The silence was absolute, a profound hush that felt sacred and terrifying. His first thought was for the horses. He waded through chest-high snow to the barn, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The animals were nervous, but alive. They had weathered the storm. It was as he was digging a path to the well that he saw them. A line of dark, moving shapes against the immaculate white, far in the distance, but coming unmistakably towards his homestead. His heart, which had grown accustomed to a cautious peace, gave a lurch. It was not a war party this time. The figures were on foot, and they moved with the slow, labored gait of people struggling through deep snow. There were maybe 24 of them, men, women, and children. They were not walking in a formation of power, but in a straggling line of survival. As they drew closer, he could see their condition. Their blankets were thin and crusted with ice. The children were being carried on the backs of the adults, their small faces pinched and blue with cold. They were not a threat. They were refugees. The blizzard, which had been a trial for him, had been a catastrophe for them. Their winter camp, wherever it was, must have been exposed, their food stores buried or depleted. They were freezing and starving. They stopped at the edge of his property, just as the warriors always had. But this was different. There was no silent, powerful waiting. There was only a desperate, shivering hope. The leader of the group, an older man with a face like weathered leather, stepped forward. He did not make a demand. He simply looked at Samuel, and then his eyes swept over the smoking chimney of the cabin, the sturdy barn, the evidence of a shelter that had withstood the storm. It was a plea more eloquent than any words. Samuel stood frozen, not with fear, but with the weight of the moment. This was the final test, the ultimate consequence of the relationship that had been woven over the past months. It was one thing to accept gifts of meat and help with repairs. It was another to have your home, your last sanctuary, become a place of refuge for an entire band of people. His meager supplies would be nothing among so many. His privacy, his hard-won solitude, would be shattered. He looked at the children, their dark eyes huge in their frost-rimed faces. He saw the boy he had fed, standing close to his mother, his small hand clutching her frozen skirt. The memory of that first, simple act of kindness echoed down through the months, leading inexorably to this. There was no choice to make. The path had been chosen for him the moment he had set that bowl of stew on the ground. He gestured toward the barn. It was the only structure large enough. He then turned and began to dig, not a path to the well, but a wider path from where they stood to the barn doors. The older man understood. He barked a short, sharp order, and the weary group stirred into motion. The men joined Samuel in digging, their strength combined making quick work of the snow. The women and children were ushered into the relative warmth of the barn. The next hours were a blur of activity. Samuel brought armfuls of firewood from his cabin and built a small, contained fire in the dirt floor of the barn, careful to keep it away from the dry hay. He brought out the smoked venison, the sacks of potatoes from his root cellar, the last of his flour. It was a pittance, but it was something. The women took over, melting snow for water, preparing a thin but hot broth to warm the children. The silence was broken now not by words, but by the sounds of life, the crackle of the fire, the soft cries of babies, the murmurs of the women as they worked. Samuel worked alongside the men, his earlier hesitation gone, replaced by a grim determination. They reinforced the barn against the wind, hung blankets to create warmer pockets, cared for the horses together. There was no hierarchy, no us in them. There was only the shared, urgent need to survive the cold. As night fell, the barn glowed with a soft orange light. The smell of wood smoke and simmering broth mingled with the scent of animals and damp wool. Samuel stood in the doorway of his cabin, looking across the short distance at the barn. The sight was surreal. His lonely homestead was now a village. The silence of the prairie was filled with the quiet hum of community. He did not go inside the barn to join them. That was not his place. His role was that of the provider, the keeper of the threshold. But as he turned to go back into his cabin, the older man appeared at the door of the barn. He walked through the snow until he stood before Samuel. He was not a chief, but an elder, a man who had seen many winters. He looked at Samuel for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Then he reached into a pouch at his belt and took out a single, perfectly crafted arrowhead, made of a dark, glossy obsidian. It was a thing of beauty and utility. He did not hand it to Samuel. Instead, he placed it carefully on the porch railing, a dark jewel on the white snow. It was not a gift for a person. It was a gift for a place. It was a marker, a sign that this homestead, this piece of earth, was now under a new protection. It was a place where a hungry child could be fed, and where a people in need could find shelter. Samuel picked up the arrowhead. It was cold and smooth in his palm. He looked from the arrowhead to the glowing barn, and then out to the starlit expanse of snow. It was not a gift for a person. It was a gift for a place. It was a marker, a sign that this homestead, this piece of earth, was now under a new protection. It was a place where a hungry child could be fed, and where a people in need could find shelter. Samuel picked up the arrowhead. It was cold and smooth in his palm. He looked from the arrowhead to the glowing barn, and then out to the starlit expanse of snow. The loneliness was gone. It had been replaced by something else, something as vast and deep as the prairie itself, a purpose. He was no longer just a man on a failed homestead. He was the keeper of a promise, and his land was no longer just a claim. It was a sanctuary. The story of the West would be written in blood and fire, but here, on this small patch of earth, a different story had been written, one bowl of stew at a time.